Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You might also consider supporting this podcast by sharing it and even donating. LCI needs your help so it can continue creating great content.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Doug Stewart, and with me today is a special guest, Shawn Ritenour. Shawn is professor of economics at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. He's also the author of the book Foundations of Economics, A Christian View, and has contributed to 3 other books. Shawn has written scores of articles and editorials on topics including cultural economics, macroeconomic theory, policy, pedagogy, and the intersection of economics and theology and ethics. Shawn, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, were you always a libertarian? Did you become a libertarian at the ripe old age of 0, or how did you get into economics and libertarianism? I'm just inviting you to kind of share your testimony with us.
Sure, that's a good question. I don't know. I wouldn't say from year 0. I will say that a lot of it, I sort of instinctually embraced liberty and freedom from a fairly young age. I was sort of a patriot, if you will. I was really interested. I sort of came of age in the era of the bicentennial. So I was 9 years old in 1976. So there's a lot of talk about the Founding Fathers and the Declaration of Independence and all that. And so I was really enthusiastic about that and believed quite a bit of the what should one say, the national mythology. And, not all of it was mythology. And so I had sort of an intuitive embracing of independence and liberty. And then I think also just living in my household, my mom in particular, who sort of managed the family budget, she was just very frugal and was good at practically economizing on a daily basis. And so we were just sort of, in our household taught not to waste and always thinking just sort of practically without a lot of with zero formal instruction, thinking about, marginalization and thinking in terms of marginal cost, marginal benefit. So, I had no knowledge that there was a discipline really called economics at the time. I went to government school all the way through high school. And so when I got to college, there was this class called, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea what I wanted to do for a career. I thought, maybe I'd like working for myself. I didn't really want to be what I would think of as a cog in a corporate machine someplace. So I thought, I liked English. I had a really good literature class when I was in high school, but I thought, what am I going to do with that? My advisor said, why don't you if you're going to work for yourself, maybe major in business, you're probably going to have to take some econ classes. I'll put you in principles of microeconomics. So I took that class and I was really excited about it. I thought that the questions that were asked in economics were vital questions. I liked the way we attempted to solve these questions. I liked the intersection between logical analysis and the real world of scarcity. I really liked that type of problem solving. So I was heavily drawn to it. I was at the same time. I grew up in. I grew up in a Christian family, and embraced Christ when I was young, and so it was of concern to me, when I wanted to pursue a career, I wanted to pursue something that I thought was valid, that was legitimate, and so irrespective of my enthusiasm for the econ class, I wanted to make sure that the economics was something worth spending your life on. I didn't want to, spend my whole life doing, ivory tower sophistry and, just interesting puzzle solving, but not have it be really something that you could call a calling. Well, it would be maybe sometime during my sophomore year, I bought a copy of Mises's Human Action and started reading that. And the way Mises develops economics from real human action really, to me, changed. I don't want to say changed everything, but made it, in some sense, made me want to be an economist. It was the book that showed me, yes, there is a way to do economics that is thoroughly compatible with the Christian view of man as a rational being made in God's image. Of course, Mises didn't put it that way, but his description of action as a starting point, I thought, is completely compatible with the Christian view of action. And so that's what really, Mises, and I think in his memoirs, said that his reading Karl Menger's Principles of Economics is what made him an economist. Well, me reading Mises's Human Action is what made me an economist. And so as I read more and more in Mises and others, I read, I did my time with Milton Friedman too, as well, and became to appreciate sort of the classical liberal perspective. And so I would say by the time I graduated college, if I had to identify myself, I'd say I was a classical liberal, sort of along Misesian lines. Since then, I have, I've read the works of Rothbard and Hoppe, and I've come to the point where I think that the economic argument about public goods, the public goods theory, therefore requiring the government to provide defense and whatnot. I don't think there's a good economic argument that necessarily has to be the case. In other words, I think that what Rothbard calls an anarcho-capitalist society could function. I'm not overly optimistic about if we ever get to that society, a society like that surviving very long, because I think that there are always, sin problems, and I think that there are, whenever it's kind of like banking in some sense, whenever you give people who are specialists in a particular area, said in this case, say national defense, these people, if they specialize, they're going to be better than anybody else using firearms. They're going to probably accumulate more and better weaponry. And at some point, some of those people are going to be tempted to say, "Hey, you know what? We can run the whole show and become sort of a tribal warlord, so to speak." And that, to me, is like the first step towards the state. So even if we got to an anarcho-capitalist society, I'm not optimistic that we'd ever have one for a really long time, but I don't think there's a good economic argument that says, well, it can't work. So that's sort of where I am. I tend not to be oddly enough, I'm really interested in economics. I'm not overly interested in political philosophy. So I don't spend a lot of time trying to decide, on any given day, am I a pure libertarian? Am I a monarchist, or what am I? But wherever we are now, the freer the society we can get, the better.
Yeah, we're a long way from anarchism anyway, at least in the United States. And
right.
If we can even get nudged in that direction, I mean, it's way more statism than you and I would feel comfortable with.
Yes.
But it's a good direction. Do you have trouble? I know you're at a Christian college, so obviously, yes. and people are taking your classes. I don't know if you teach only electives or if some of them are required or what, but do you have? What's your experience with other Christians and kind of, I wouldn't say convincing them, but like getting them to see the benefit of understanding at least some Econ 101?
Yeah, I think the students come in with, in general, I think a desire to want to understand how the world works. And I think that they understand that, even if they don't necessarily, they're skeptical of economists in general, I think that they do want to understand the economic aspect of life and how that works. And so I think the students have some hunger for knowledge, and I found the best way to sort of satisfy that hunger is to show them step by step the economic principles as we derive from realistic human action. In other words, you that's one thing I really love about Mises. You don't start off with, well, assume that this is the case, and assume that that is the case, and assume that this is the case, and then if we have all these assumptions, we can tease out these implications of our functions or whatever. We don't rightly students say, well, wait a minute, what about if these assumptions aren't true? So no, you start with say, well, we got a problem. So you start with realistic human action and say, well, hey, they know by looking at and just thinking about their own lives that, well, yes, they do act purposely. They do apply means to achieve ends. And then we can say, okay, what does this actually imply? What is involved in the choice of trying to achieve one end and not the other? And then things start to fall out, so that I'm a firm believer. I'm a firm believer because I kind of felt it in my own life when I was a student, that the student wants to know, to a certain extent, why. Why do we think these things? Why do we think the law of supply and the law of demand are true? Why is it that when we increase the money supply, that the purchasing power of money will be lower than it would be otherwise? I mean, why is that the case? And when you can link it back to, well, this is the way, it's because of the way people act, and then you can go further at a Christian school, because then I can say, okay, Christians act this way. In other words, they act purposely because that's the way we're made. I mean, that's part of being made in God's image. And then when you see that, then it all hangs together. And so it's a whole lot easier. Now, I do find it's interestingly, I think some professors are more skeptical than others about economics as a discipline. And I think a large part's because that they've had, the economics they've become acquainted with is not very satisfactory, or they don't like some of the, shall we, free market or libertarian implications of the policy prescriptions that you find in Austrian economics.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of people dislike an economist's view because it seems easy to be rife with bias or political ideology, when in fact it doesn't have to be.
That's right. And it is interesting too, even some students, you have to sort of slow down in that regard. In other words, some students think they're interested in economics when they're really interested in like free market policy advocacy.
Yeah.
And so, we have to say, okay, your conclusion, I agree with you on your conclusion, but you have to show me why the conclusion is valid. And that's where the economic analysis has to come in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I had a friend of mine who was kind of a mentor for a little while in some biblical studies, and he wouldn't call himself on the left because I know that he chastises them for a lot of things that you and I would as well, but he's also definitely not on the right. He's definitely more progressive in his theology and everything. And we were talking about something along the lines of social justice, and I said something about economics. He goes, I don't want to learn, that's not important. I said, well, if you care at all about social justice, then you should learn a little bit of economics, because every pronouncement that you make has to do with it immediately, or maybe not immediately, but it soon runs into the problem of scarcity and conflicting norms, conflicting expectations, and, intentions don't get the job done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
And the worst possible thing is to think you're doing good and actually be working against your very wishes because of economic law.
Yeah. In fact, yesterday I was talking with somebody on Facebook. We were kind of squabbling over the definition of violence. And of course, I take the definition of physical threat of force, or force that's physical. And this person was saying, well, yeah, I agree that the state does that, but it's not the only institution that does that. There's all these others. And one of the things he used as an example was employers who don't pay a living wage are doing and he didn't say different kind of violence, but they're also doing violence to the people that they are not treating well. And he, of course, used sweatshops in that example. And I thought, okay, fine. You could make the argument that there's harm being done, but it's not violence. And then this is why Facebook isn't a good place to argue, because you want to respond right away. But a day later, today, I'm thinking, having a living wage or imposing legally a living wage is also, by his standard of violence, doing violence to the people who don't have the output that would match to the living wage. So it works both ways. And, I don't think if it weren't for places like the Mises Institute and FEE, I wouldn't have understood how to conceptualize these sort of the unseen, as Bastia puts it, the unseen consequences of quote unquote good policy or good intentions, or even things that immediately have good outcomes for a lot of people might be detrimental in the long run.
Oh, absolutely. And it may work out fine for people, a few people in the long run, or even in the immediate run that are going to get the higher wage rate. But whenever the state does that, they inevitably draw a wedge between people because they benefit some at the actual expense of others. I mean, the people that lose their jobs or don't get hired at all because not only are they not making a living wage, they're not making a wage at all. I mean, they're destitute.
Yeah. Yeah, the living wage is essentially supposedly, like the Bernie Sanders folks, is supposedly supposed to be like an antidote to poverty. Part of their anti-poverty agenda, but creates it.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you think of Christians who would say, yeah, but as Christians, we should be more concerned with the plight of those who are on the margins, who are poorer, and we shouldn't be it's not equal to say that a rich person and a poor person, you're taking a little bit from the rich to just give the poor a little tiny bump or whatever. And so there's nothing wrong with those kinds of policies. Because as a Christian, we should be concerned with the benefits that this applies to the poor. So if there's a segment of the population that bears the benefit of a policy, it doesn't really matter to them that the cost is a minimal cost to either it's spread out over everybody, or it's only a very small portion of that which belonged to the rich.
Yeah, well, I think the number one response to that is that, in some sense, justice actually is not a cost-benefit analytical sort of thing. In other words, we don't determine justice based on counting up the costs and benefits, and if the benefits outweigh the costs, well, that's a just action. Every economic policy, when the government intervenes, there's going to be costs, and it's going to harm some people. And if we are in an interventionist state, and then we move to a more free society, those people that are have been benefiting aren't going to, the gravy train's going to run out for them, and they're going to feel themselves harmed or put out or what have you. So the question is, okay, what do we do? Or does that mean that we're just stuck in the status quo? And I'd say the answer is no, because ethics is not determined on a cost benefit analysis. If ethics, if the ethics against murder and the commandments against murder and against theft, if that, as I think it does, implies social ethics of a free society and private property, then any move towards in economic policy towards that is a move towards a more just, more free society, and irregardless of who benefits and who gets harmed. Now, if we move to a freer society, and there are people that are still that are downtrodden. There are people that are economically disadvantaged for one reason or another. Well, then certainly we do have a call not to turn our heads or turn our faces from these people. We're called to minister to them. But then the question is, what's the best means? What's the best way to do it? And I think that if we had the freer the society we had, in general, the more prosperous that society is going to be. So the number of people in abject poverty is going to be much lower. We wouldn't be sort of fostering a culture of dependency in any way. But then the people that the poor that would indeed be left, well, then we just minister to them. I mean, I want to say, everyone thinks, well, we have to do something. We have to do something. What they mean is when they say, we, society has to do something, they mean other people have to do it.
Yes.
Not me.
Right.
It's not me. It's the 1%. Let's make the 1% do it. Or let's go. Let's why be narrow. Let's have the 5% do it. Right. Like, well, make other people do it. And well, no, the responsibility is on us. If you see your neighbor in need, help them. That's the solution.
Yeah.
And it can be done. I think it is probably more challenging in urban areas where, I think you have I don't know, a larger critical. I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know this for sure, but you have a larger critical mass, I would assume, of people in more dire need. I don't know if that's true. I mean, on the other hand, you have places like Appalachia and other things like that. So I don't know. It just seems to me that too often, our number one, so like the number one response is have somebody else do it. We'll have the state take care of it for us, because I'm not having to pay a whole lot of taxes compared to other people,
right.
And so that'll be easier on me. And
Yeah.
I don't think the scripture lets us off the hook like that.
Yeah, I think David Granovsky calls it hiring ethics, where there's a problem with just simply saying, well, I want to hire the violence of the state to do something that is, that if I were doing it, I wouldn't be allowed to, take the money of other people.
That's right. So like the thou shalt not steal except by majority vote.
Yeah, that's. Oh man, I get in a lot of arguments with progressive Christians, and I'm just like, all you want is other people's money, and you're never going to be satisfied because there's always more of it.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is like we're actually seeing the elimination of poverty globally, and the only way that we're able to see that is through markets, and I'm even willing to say that they aren't, well, it doesn't even need to be willing to say something like this, but they're not entirely free markets. Like this isn't like all those places where there's this triumph of progress. They're not like libertarian, utopias,
right?
Where they're not quote unquote free societies, but they are societies that have had stronger property rights and better access to free trade with each other and with other nations. And all of a sudden, like India and China are not in poverty anymore in mine and your lifetime. Yeah. And why can't we just apply that to a lot of other places? So that's the irony that they're anti-poverty at the very thing that would lift people out of poverty. It's like, oh well, no, that won't work here. We need other people's money to just hand out to them. That's right. Yeah, I think I often wonder if as a society progresses in prosperity, there comes a point where there's enough people of higher incomes that are experiencing or are able to enjoy a certain amount of wealth in terms of certain types of goods and whatnot, and when it becomes widespread enough, I think humans have a tendency to quickly move to see certain things that we perceive as being good things or nice to have, and in a generation we quickly move them to rights. Mm-hmm. It's not just good to have these things, but we have a right to have these things, because in America everybody should have a right to X, Y, or Z. Yeah, and I think the standard reply to that by people that are on the left is that there is a relative movement of things that are required to sort of just not get along, but get on in life as societies grow. Like, for instance, I could see it, like, for instance, if somebody's poor today, they need access to a telephone of some kind, whether it's landline or not. But, there's programs out there that provide cheap cell phones to people who are in poverty. And I would say, I'm not justifying that those programs, but it's very easy to say or to conclude or easy to argue that having access to a telephone is critical to sort of getting your own job to taking control of your life. And, if we want to do that whole mindset of like, well, we want people to pull themselves out of poverty or work to get out of poverty. Well, how can they do that if they have no access to a phone? Like there's all those those kind of things. And so I would sort of say, well, I guess to some extent that's true. That doesn't necessarily justify certain policies.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, there are things. I mean, the same. You can say the same thing about food, right? I mean, none of us can live without food.
Yeah.
And yet we don't have. What I find interesting is we don't have like a food czar to make sure that we have exactly the right specific food, the right specific good. I mean, we do have welfare programs to aid people with lower incomes so that they have quote unquote enough food. But even then, I mean, I think that's we have to have food, and yet, I mean, I would argue we don't need. We certainly don't need a bureaucratic welfare state to make sure that people have that everybody has enough food to sustain themselves. There's more than one way to provide for people's needs, and the government's just one, and not a very good one at that.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, if it were to use my cell phone analogy, there's the existence of an inexpensive cell phone has only been made possible through the market, and that's those same kind of forces are the same with food. I mean, food can be inexpensive and food can be expensive, and I'm not guessing that any welfare program that I'm aware of is giving people Whole Foods gift cards. And so, although Whole Foods isn't as pricey as it once was. Right. They're getting. I'm not sure exactly how these programs work. I do know that they're means tested, things like that.
Yeah.
The government, so to speak, is only able to afford to have these programs because food is already inexpensive, and this is like the last bit of people who aren't able to get there. It's not expensive. If it were an expensive good, there wouldn't be a government program to provide for it.
Hey folks, Norman Horn here from LCI. Would you do us a quick favor and rank us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe to us? High rankings helps us get the word out there. And now let's get back to the show.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. It's and that's in some sense that speaks to our point that Mises had this article, a brief article called "Luxuries into Necessities." And in some sense, that's what happens in the marketplace. The first, when some good or new consumer item comes out, let's say like the smartphone or whatever, or I remember the DVD player or the CD player. It was originally super expensive, and only the upper economic echelon was able to afford it. But then over time, as things caught on, economies of scale were able to be reaped, and the prices of them all came down.
Yeah. And
so within a generation, it's not looked at anymore as like a luxury. It's like, oh, we got to have it. Whether or not we actually have to have it is another thing, but we got to have it. And sometimes these things like a phone are very necessary for getting around and getting gainful employment and that kind of thing. Other times it is a matter of we could actually do without it, but our life would be a whole lot better if we had it. So we're just going to call it a right.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That issue came up. I remember talking about the issue of net neutrality. And, people saying we have to have the government ensuring net neutrality, because if we don't, the corporation is going to be able to shut some people off, and, some people aren't going to get, they're going to get biased news, and, they're not going to be able to get the information they need. And I remember arguing and saying, look, but the whole thing, this presupposes you have a right to internet access. And they said, well, actually, you do. Nobody. How can people in today's marketplace, survive economically without it? And I'm thinking, well, I've got I've got two parents in Iowa that survived into their 70s without any internet access, and they have it now. But it is a pure luxury. If the internet went out today, their life would not change very much at all, right? So this idea that, if somebody who's 25 feels like they need something, it must be a right. That's not a very good. It's not a very good
litmus test.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, as Christians, we often think about these subjects from, we can think of them from a theological perspective. The Bible doesn't give us an abundance of economic principles. I mean, there's some learning from people like, Ludwig von Mises and others who gives us some economic principles and things like that. But it's not like the Bible is absent of economic ideas or principles or cultural things that Christians ought to take very seriously. And one of those things is the what you call in one of your essays, fruitful dominion. And so you start off that article basically saying that, like, from chapter 1 in the Bible, Genesis 1, we find that we live in a teleological universe, that God made all things for a purpose, to give man the first commandment, to have dominion over the earth. Now, I know that when I got out of college, I started reading some probably left-leaning thinkers in Christian theology, and they were not very happy with this idea that man was supposed to have dominion, because what they saw was an improper use of it, and therefore, we should be very cautious about taking that mandate and just doing whatever we want. So what, I guess the starting point would be, what does it mean to be fruitful and multiply, and how does economics and the free society sort of fit into that?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I would want to take one step back and just ask ourselves, okay, what is this? What is this mandate? I mean, does it exist? And so, yeah, I began looking at and the idea is not original with me. There are other writers who have theologians much brighter than myself who've identified this mandate that we find in Genesis 1 and 2, the demanding to be fruitful, multiply, to have dominion. It's what it says, to rule over the earth, to fill the earth with people, and to work it and keep it, right? And so there's a sort of a dual mandate to work, to cultivate, to in some sense exercise our faculties as image bearers, to creatively draw forth the potentialities that God has put in creation. I mean, that's what he wants us to do. At the same time, right, we're to work and keep it. We're not to spoil it. We're not to destroy it. We're to make use of it. The word dominion means dominion for use, right? So it's not just to be an overseer. It's not just to be, like a museum curator. Like, the creation is here, and we're supposed to just watch it and follow the admonition of MC Hammer and don't touch this, right? But we're called to actually make use of it, but we're called to make use of it in a way that doesn't spoil it or destroy it or waste it. And so the question is, how do we do that? How do we exercise dominion? And now it's even trickier, because the original dominion is not the dominion mandate is not a product of the fall. I mean, sometimes you get these people who will say, "Well, okay, but sure, we've got to work, we've got to do things, but that's only because of sin. That's because of the curse." And no, the cultural mandate was given to man before the fall. And I would argue that after the fall, the dominion mandate is even more important, because now we live in a fallen world where the ground is cursed, and instead of bringing forth fruits and vegetables naturally, it brings forth thorns and thistles. And so, if we're going to eat bread, we have to eat bread by the sweat of our brow. And so we have to work even more. So the question is, how do we exercise dominion in a world of aggravated scarcity without either starving to death or killing one another in the process? How do we escape some sort of social Darwinian barbaric struggle for survival? Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. And economics is very important in this, because economics shows us that it's by people engaging in society, in the social division of labor, where people are able to specialize at doing what they're the best at doing, being productive in that area, whatever it is, and then trading their surplus, their excess, with other people who have excess in other goods. And in so doing, everybody in society is relatively more productive, and hence everybody in society they have access to more goods to satisfy more ends. And so the social division of labor, the way we overcome this problem is by engaging in society, which by the way, sort of shows that it's simply not true that that a free market is some sort of the free market is a world of isolated atoms where individuals that only care about themselves and only do what only benefits themselves. That's simply not true. A free society is a world where we have a social division of labor where everybody depends upon everybody else for the satisfaction of their ends. And so there's a common, even when we have differences in ultimate ends and differences in values, there is a commonality of people in society, a common value is the continuation of the division of labor. Because as the division of labor continues, that allows all of us to have more access, especially the least productive of us, access to more goods than we would have without the division of labor. And then, of course, economics also tells us about capital formation and its contribution to economic human flourishing and technological improvement, and then economics also reminds us, good economics reminds us, that all of this activity needs to be coordinated somehow for it all to work together, for there not to be massive surpluses and shortages. And the way for that to happen is for there to be entrepreneurs who have access to market prices to engage in calculating profit and loss, so that when entrepreneurs produce things that people really demand at a high level, they earn a profit. And if they end up producing something that people really don't want, they earn losses for essentially wasting resources. And so if we have a free society that allows entrepreneurs to reap profits when they invest wisely, or incur losses when they produce things that people ultimately don't want, that provides the discipline, shall we say, and rewards those entrepreneurs for doing exactly what society wants them to do, which is provide the goods that they want at the lowest possible prices. And that's, as we do that allows us to sustain a growing population that in which all of the individual persons are fulfilling their callings as they've been gifted and talented by God. So I think understanding economics is really, really important for us to understand how a free and free society can exercise dominion in relative peace.
Something that has been sort of recently pointed out to me has been that and you mentioned it here a little bit, is that the cultural mandate was to be fruitful and multiply was pre-fall in the scripture. And if Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful and multiply and have dominion over the earth, and that there was some sort of labor involved, then they're basically doing work under the conditions of flourishing and prosperity to begin with.
Yes.
As opposed to we need to work because we need to at least survive, and if we're lucky, we'll do more than just survive. We'll get along. We'll get along well, etc. And you're also working on. So that's just a point that I hadn't really thought of, is that the Garden of Eden is a vision for what life ought to be like without sin, and it includes prosperity. It includes flourishing as we do work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and you're working on a book that is probably at least a year out from kind of when we're talking now, based on what you told me earlier, on the economics of prosperity. What is this project about?
Well, it's a development of some of the themes that were in this article, Fruitful Dominion, that you were referring to. I'm basically wanting to take the economic principles in that article and develop them more fully from an Austrian perspective. I teach a class, Economic Expansion Development, at Grove City, and there's not a single volume, a single book that sort of what I would say lays out a theory of economic expansion development to my satisfaction. There's a lot of great great economic treatises that you can draw from, passages by passage or chapter by chapter, but there's not been, as far as I know, a book that sort of brings it all together and shows the different what I call sources of prosperity, things that I mentioned, the division of labor, capital accumulation, technological improvement, and entrepreneurship, which is key, that almost every mainstream account of development sort of leaves out. To bring them all together to show that, yes, these sources of prosperity are important, but also important, and this is something that's not widely recognized, for them to function well, for the division of labor and capital accumulation, technology, and entrepreneurial activity, for them all to be, for them all to contribute to actual economic prosperity, they have to work together, right? In other words, if we decided as a bureaucrat, say, hey, the secret is, say, capital. If you look, we have to have capital and capital goods to be productive. So let's just pour government money. Let's have a 5-year industrial plan. We're going to pour resources into the building up of the capital structure, the capital stock, and we'll be better off. Well, that presumes a whole lot of things. It presumes that we know which capital goods will be best suited to meet the needs of the people in society. It presumes that we know the best technologies to use, in which we can use the best combinations of goods that we can make to we can use to get the best outcome, to get the maximum output. It presumes that the government bureaucrat knows all of this, and then he's going to act accordingly. And in reality, of course, bureaucrats don't know these things. They certainly don't know. They don't have any special insight on what consumers want. Maybe they know that they need food, clothing, and shelter. But what kind of food? What kind of clothing? What kind of shelter? What factors are best to make food and to make clothing and to make shelter? They don't necessarily know all of these things. And so the way for all these sources of prosperity to come together is for entrepreneurs to make these decentralized decisions using market prices to calculate profit and loss. And market prices are absolutely crucial, because if an entrepreneur invests a certain amount of money to make T-shirts and he's able to sell them at a price that yields a profit, those prices, the prices of the shirts themselves and the prices of the fabric, the sewing machine, the labor, etc., all of those prices are ultimately determined by the subjective preferences of people in society. So when an entrepreneur makes a shirt and sells it at a profit, and he knows he's making a profit because he compares the price of the shirt to the sum of the prices of the factors that he uses to produce a shirt. Because those prices are all determined by people's subjective preferences, we know that when he makes a profit by productively serving society, by adding value to society. But we don't have market prices that communicates that unless we live in a world of voluntary exchange, which means we have to have private property. We have to be in a society where people are not forced to buy from anybody, and people are not kept from buying from anybody. Right, and that's a world of private property. So what I'm wanting to do in this book is basically explain all of that in more detail and show, how the different sources of prosperity contribute to economic progress, to show how these different engines have to work together, and then show that in order for these engines to work together, we have to have the social institution of private property, sound money, and that implies certain policies that basically a policy of the free market, a policy without, no price controls, no interventionist regulations, no confiscatory taxation, things like that.
Yeah, basically barriers to trade.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Shawn, anytime I read something that you've written or listen to a talk that you've done, I always learn something. And so obviously I'm going to encourage our listeners to go and find more of you. We're out of time on this episode, but there is one other place there is at least one other place that they can go. And that is they can do a search for Austrian economics as common grace. What's the soundbite version of what do you argue for there? That's an interesting title, that, by the way.
Thank you. The thesis of that paper is that sound economics, from my perspective, it's Misesian praxeological economics. That economics, because it is true and is compatible with the Christian view of man, that body of thought, even though not developed predominantly by Christians, is something that God graciously allows us to know and to discover. And so it's common grace in that sense. It's common as opposed to saving grace. It's not, as far as we know, Mises, Rothbard, Karl Menger, Bombaverk, we're not Christians, and we're not redeemed. We're not justified and sanctified. And yet, God in his grace allowed them to discover things that are tremendously helpful in terms of us learning about the economic aspect of creation. And so that's something that's available. It's common to all men. And so that's why I think theologians would classify that as common grace. And I argue, because it's true, I think these principles are true, that they are indeed common grace. In other words, it's not just they're fundamental facts of life. It's not just political sloganeering. It's not, I don't believe it's true because I want to abolish welfare. It's not driven by political bias. It's driven by a bias for the truth.
Well, thanks for joining us. I just loved our conversation. There's always so much to learn. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.